Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. I'm Mike Baker with United Way of Greater Cincinnati, and really pleased to be partnering with the Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio and Thompson-Hine to bring you this important information that I know is top of mind for many of us about returning to work post-quarantine. So just as a reminder, we are recording this afternoon's webinar, and we will make that recording available to the attendees along with the slides. We do have our chat open today, so feel free to introduce yourself and let folks know who all's here. It's good to see so many friends and partners on the call today. So I just wanted to say a few words about United Way. Like many of our organizations, we are really focused on our COVID-19 response right now, kind of resetting a short-term strategy that we know will last probably over the next 12 to 18 months around how do we help our community respond and recover from the COVID crisis. And one of the key areas that we're focusing on strategically is how do we stabilize systems of care for individuals and families across our region. And we know that means a strong nonprofit sector. And so we're looking at what we can do to increase support in the sector, partially through our funding and through shared funding, and also through sharing best practices and resources that we might be able to access. And so you've seen some of that work over the last couple months with our activation with the Greater Cincinnati Foundation of the Regional Response Fund, which raised and disseminated more than $7 million into the community for direct response needs. We're doing things like this partnership with the Pro Bono Partnership to bring forward best practices so we all can kind of eliminate the need to do our individual research and hear from experts on what those best practices are on dealing with COVID and the crisis. And one place where we've been able to help bring some resources in the community is around personal protective equipment. So we have, thanks to a great partnership with P&G, received a large donation of disposable face masks and hand sanitizer. And if you haven't yet had an opportunity to take advantage of that, I'd encourage you to send an inquiry on any needs you might have around face masks and hand sanitizer to this email on your screen, ppe@uwgc.org. It's a monitored email address, and we can respond. We are continuing to get shipments of both face masks and hand sanitizer, and have been able to meet most of the requests for that from nonprofits and community groups. No need to be a United Way partner. Those are available to any group throughout the region, as long as we have the resources to fill your request. With that, what I'd like to do is turn things over to Marcy Honeycutt with the Pro Bono Partnership to give us a little bit of a sense of who they are and what they're doing in response to COVID. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mike. As Mike mentioned, I am Marcy Honeycutt. I am the Dayton Director and Counsel for Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio. And our mission at PBPO is to strengthen our community. We engage attorney volunteers to provide nonprofits with free legal services tailored to their business needs. We are very proud to have assisted well over 200 local organizations in both the greater Cincinnati and Dayton communities. Here you see on the slide several that you may be familiar with. And some of the different types of legal projects that we handle range from governing board responsibilities, helping boards understand basic best practices, their fiduciary duties, things like that, helping them with drafting bylaws, reviewing contracts, drafting contracts, various corporate responsibilities or just corporate needs, employment matters, fundraising, helping to understand those pesky regulations that come up, intellectual property issues, registering trademarks, copyrights, or licensing those property interests, memorandums of understanding, personnel handbooks, and real estate matters, just to name a few. So some of the hallmarks of our organization are we deliver quality legal services from very experienced company and law firm attorneys. We work with not only our you will work with not only attorneys within our organization, but also those that are from companies that are just extremely skilled, whether they are in-house or external. And they will be very well versed both in the areas of nonprofit law as well as whatever area of subject matter expertise that you are looking for that has to do with the business matter at hand. We help identify those legal issues and the areas of potential risk for your organization. And we help you implement those basic best practices that you really need to be on the lookout for. We place those legal projects, as I mentioned, with the subject matter experts, and a PBPO attorney oversees each and every project. And all of this is provided free of charge to your organization. So there really is a great amount of value add to that service to your organization. We currently are offering to our clients a COVID-19 response hotline with all of the stuff everybody is looking at right now with the pandemic. And as I'm sure you are sitting here today, very thankful for the information that Megan is about to provide all of us. A lot of questions have popped up in the employment context. So we are trying to respond to our customers' needs with this in mind. So we have the employment helpline, but we also are trying to obviously provide webinars, weekly news alerts and updates, and services in that realm. So if you are interested in more information, we encourage you to reach out to us. Please join us, our nonprofit mailing list. You can email us at info@pbpohio.org. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Megan Glowacki, who is a partner of the Labor and Employment Group at Thompson Hine. She has been in practice for 10 years and she is super knowledgeable. She is a Super Lawyers Rising Star of 2020. And we are just extremely grateful for her time and her valuable expertise. So thank you so much, Megan. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marcy, and thanks, Mike, and thanks everybody for spending your lunch hour with me. As Marcy said, I'm a partner at Thompson Hine. I practice in our labor and employment practice group. And for the last month, my job has been to help our clients prepare to reopen. And that's a general term because for some employers, for some organizations, really, despite the COVID-19, your services were so essential that there was no quote-unquote closure. But we are sensitive to the fact that even during that March, April, May, unbelievably 3 months of our lives time, we probably had fewer employees or volunteers or clients in our physical workspace, even if there were some essential operations that continued. Now, as June has started to open up here in Ohio and in other states, we're really thinking about how do we continue to bring people back up to close to 100% capacity in our workspace. So I recognize as we talk through the reopenings, everybody's going to be at a slightly different place. You'll have a different industry. You may have remained open and at full capacity since March. You may be an organization that hasn't brought a single person back yet. I'm going to try and address sort of the full expanse of where you might be. I'll also mention that I understand that there are folks in a variety of different industries or service organizations. I'm going to talk generally today about office environments, schools, hospitals, other individuals who provide services to the general public will want to be aware of any industry-specific requirements on top of those. But please use the chat function, which Marcy will monitor for Q&A. I'll try and get to as many as we possibly can. And if I'm not able to, I'll follow up with you after today's webinar. So to start, this slide is a little dated at this point because for the most part of our 50 states, every state is in some phase of reopening. Or if you are Governor Cuomo in New York City, you might be threatening to close states back up after a weekend of what appeared to be a lack of social distancing in some portions of the state. Here in Ohio is where I'll be primarily focused, although certainly can assist with issues throughout any of the states, but I'll refer mainly to Ohio's state reopening orders as we go through today. So first and foremost, start by formulating a plan to reopen, or if you have continued some essential services, formulate a plan to bring additional employees, volunteers, clients back into the workplace. A couple of the things that we're going to talk about: knowing what are the requirements in the state where you have facilities and or employees. And it's important to differentiate between what you must do and what you could or should do. Assess on-site social distancing needs and hygiene measures. We're going to talk about all of this in great detail. Consider whether you want medical certifications of some or all employees, or whether you plan to take temperatures of employees, visitors, or clients who come on site. You want to think about whether you're going to have any business or personal travel restrictions, meaning quarantine upon return from travel. And then plan for requests for quote-unquote accommodations, exceptions to the rules, employees who simply don't feel ready to come back to the workplace. And we're going to talk about those quote-unquote accommodations because those are really meaty and difficult issues. So first things first, when you're thinking about your plan, know that one size doesn't fit all. If you have been preparing to reopen and simply went to Google, you could find reopening plans of Lear Corporation that they posted online. That is a 64-page document that talks A to Z exactly what that corporation plans to do upon return. It is a very thorough document. It may have absolutely no applicability to your particular organization. So while there are templates and forms that you can find online, make sure you tailor it to your specific organization. You'll want to think about CDC and particular industry recommendations, OSHA requirements, as I referenced before, state requirements and recommendations, and to know the difference. But the fourth bullet point is really the most important here. What fits your organization? From an employee perspective, from a financial perspective, meaning what can your organization afford to do? It would be great if the recommendation was that everybody had a 6-foot-high panel between everybody's workspace, but it may not be possible for your group to be able to effectuate that change. So there may be recommendations out there that your organization just isn't able to implement. What fits your customers and clients? And what fits your organization culture? Those are all key aspects of your reopening plan. First, and probably most talked about, and I will tell you that probably even back in March, I had never heard the term social distancing, and now I use it every 20 minutes. What it means is analyzing how close together, how closely packed your work environment is, how much direct within 6 feet of each other interaction is there between your employees, your volunteers, your clients, how much physical space is in your workplace. And even if you have already brought employees or clients back into your workplace, I still recommend that you do this analysis. It's almost a walkthrough where you physically must walk through your work environment and analyze and think about these issues. Some of them include, where are employees actually needed in the physical workplace? Do individuals have separate office or cubicle desk space? Even if somebody has their own desk space, is it anticipated that your clients will be have the need to come up and stand right where those people are? Or do you have employees and volunteers who can continue to work remotely? More or less, who do you need to have in the workplace? For those who you do need to have, what time do employees and volunteers and clients arrive, and what time do they leave? Do you have a mass ingress and egress of individuals at 8 a.m. and at 5 p.m.? Is it possible, if you do have that mass ingress and egress, to spread people out so that everyone's not congregating through the entrance and exit at the exact same time? Where exactly do employees and volunteers perform their work, and where do your clients receive their services? For most office environments, what I suggest is that a lead individual who's planning your return to work walk through the physical workday of somebody. What doors do they come in? What places in the office do people frequent? Are there areas where employees and volunteers and clients tend to congregate around kitchens or kitchenettes, around meeting rooms, around entrance desks? Where are those high volume, high touch areas? And what does your organization have control over? Or what are, on the opposite spectrum, shared or tenant spaces? Do you as an organization share elevators, lobbies, areas of the building where multiple members of the public or other organizations have access to? And for those areas that are public or shared tenant spaces, you'll want to start thinking about how to handle those. It isn't like your employees simply leave your physical workplace and are in a bubble as they enter and leave your facility. All of those points of contact with other individuals should be thought about when we're talking about social distancing. So once you've done an analysis of your workplace, where you know where people congregate, where you know where employees work, where you know that there are high volume areas, you'll want to start thinking about what controls you can put in place to keep people socially distant. And there's really two types of controls: engineering controls and administrative controls. The difference between the two being, engineering controls are the things that you as an organization can control without employees helping you or interfering with that. Engineering controls are solely in your discretion. Administrative controls, on the other hand, require employees' buy-in and require employees to help you and assist you. So as you can imagine, the more engineering controls you can put into place, the better you are guaranteed that those controls will assist with social distancing. So some things to think about: increase ventilation in your office space, or at least open windows. Increasing the physical workspace between people. If you typically had desks that sat back to each other because it was nice and a collaborative environment, can you rearrange those desks so that they are 6 feet apart and not facing each other anymore? Really consider closing gathering spaces, kitchens, and meeting rooms. You can do that by locking doors, or in several clients that I've had, frankly, even in the kitchen in my office here, there are parts of the kitchen that are open, such as the refrigerator and the sink and the place where you grab your water. But caution tape has been roped around the various kitchen tables and chairs to prohibit people from gathering in those spaces. Consider physical barriers like partitions if you absolutely cannot increase the physical space between people. And limit visitor access, and this is important to the extent possible. Obviously, clients and volunteers can be a very important part of your organization. Some of your organizations can't thrive without visitor access. But to the extent that you're able to keep out third parties where normally you might have, a monthly meeting or work group of specific people or board members, things of that nature, continue to limit those people's access and encourage remote work meetings like this one here. As I mentioned before, administrative controls are the things that we're going to require our employees to help us implement. And because we need to rely on them, they are inherently less effective. Nevertheless, they are important. So things to remind employees about: minimizing face-to-face meetings and continuing to replace them with virtual. If working from home can be productive for folks, they should continue to do so until you're ready to bring everybody back in. As I mentioned previously, trying to stagger work days and times as well as lunch and break periods so that people aren't congregating in your entrance and exit or in your kitchens and cafeteria areas. Consider use of face coverings even if not required by the state. Here in Ohio, in general office environments, you must use a face covering in a common area. If you have a designated workspace, such as a cubicle area, employees don't need to wear that face covering while they're in the designated workspace. If they leave their cubicle to walk to the bathroom, to the kitchen, outside, in the common areas, they need to use a face covering. In a face covering, the best requirement, of course, is a mask, a surgical mask or a cloth mask that employees either are provided by you, the organization, or which they can bring in. Some organizations will allow employees to use gaiters or bandanas, anything that will sufficiently cover both their nose and their mouth. I'll tell you a bit of a war story that I have had frequent employers ask if it was okay to simply use a tissue taped to the side of employees' faces. No, that doesn't suffice. So while we can be somewhat flexible about the type of face covering an employee utilizes, it's important that you're actually following the face covering requirements since it is mandated in the state of Ohio for general office environments. There is, under the state's order, an exception for individuals who have a medical need and their asthma, skin allergic reaction, their underlying medical condition, according to their doctor, would prevent them from wearing a face covering. We'll talk about that in a little more detail, but that's really the only exception to the rule. In terms of hygiene, I really hope at this point everybody's employees and volunteers and clients are not utilizing each other's desks and phones and equipment. And if anything has come out of this COVID situation, I expect it will be a healthy individualization of employees' own things and not utilizing others. But it is important to remind employees of that. Have on hand sufficient PPE. For a while in the April and May time period, you absolutely couldn't find hand sanitizer or Lysol or other disinfecting materials. At this point, I think it's becoming somewhat easier to find that PPE, but have it on hand before you come back to work. And enhance your cleaning schedule, especially of common areas and equipment. And that walkthrough is important to think about this type of thing. If you have a copier or a fax machine, a common phone, those types of areas that get high touch use need to be cleaned after every use. So think about where you need to provide disinfecting wipes throughout your physical workspace so that employees have easy access to them. And most importantly, communicate. Notify your employees and volunteers of what you have been doing with respect to COVID-19 and social distancing. For the first point, it gives people comfort that you're taking this issue seriously, that you're thinking about them and their health and well-being and your clients' health and well-being. It also helps address the spread of misinformation from employees, and it gives them clear guidance on what your expectation of their required behavior is. That way, if somebody isn't following your required behavior, you can issue appropriate discipline as needed. And from the legal perspective, document, document, document. Document every step that your organization took to try and ensure that employees and volunteers and clients were healthy and safe in your work environment. You've probably seen news stories of lawsuits being filed against Walmart, grocery chains, things of that nature, because the employee was allegedly contracted COVID-19 because of their work at that employer. The defense, or one defense to such lawsuits are the steps that the organization took to try and prevent the spread of COVID-19. So while it might seem silly, think about having at least one internal document that analyzes everything that you've done, from providing Lysol wipes to closing off kitchen spaces to mandating that no in-person meetings occur if you can't be socially distant. Have in one place everything that you've done to ensure a healthy and safe return to the workplace. So I'm going to switch now to some health and wellness issues. Let's assume that you have analyzed your workplace, you are ready to return altogether, or you're ready to bring additional employees back into the workplace. Or frankly, you've been in the workplace the whole time and still have some open questions about this. What can you do in terms of requiring medical clearance? At this point, it's still fairly broad. You absolutely can require employees who were ill with COVID-19 or who were required to quarantine by their doctor because of their proximity to a COVID-19 positive patient, to provide medical clearance to return to work. So if an employee was ill or if they were quarantined by their doctor, you can require a doctor's note to return to work. For those employees who weren't necessarily ill or quarantined, you absolutely can ask them, as well as volunteers, to self-certify that within the past 14 days they haven't had symptoms of COVID-19, they have not been in close contact with anybody diagnosed with COVID-19, and that they haven't traveled to a COVID-19 hotspot. And one question I often get is, well, what is a COVID-19 hotspot, and isn't that constantly changing? The answer is yes, it is constantly changing. The good news is the CDC tends to keep a very close eye on areas that are spiking. And the CDC's website will often is daily up to date on areas that have high proportion of COVID-19 diagnoses. So New York City for a significant period of time, as well as parts of California. But as states have started to reopen and some states have seen recent spikes, the CDC is a good resource for determining what the current hotspots are. One of the most frequent issues that I have seen raised is, can we take an employee's temperature before they enter the workplace every day or on a specific day? And the answer is, right now, yes. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which oversees the Americans with Disabilities Act, has said explicitly that it is permissible to take employee temperatures while COVID-19 remains a pandemic. So under normal ADA rules, taking an employee's temperature is a medical, um, not a medical device, but using a medical device to do a medical exam. And such medical exams are not permitted under normal circumstances unless there is a direct threat to the employee's health or to other employees' health. And the EEOC has said that obviously COVID-19 is a direct threat. And so while this pandemic is in place, such medical exams are permissible. I just warn that at some point in COVID-19, sooner, hopefully rather than later, will no longer be a direct threat. So please don't add this to your daily routine and 2 years from now still be taking employee temperatures. I am hopeful, excuse me, that sometime soon, sooner than later, we will be outside of this direct threat. But for the moment, taking employee temperatures is still permissible. It is not generally required in Ohio, but some state reopening orders do require employees to certify that they do not have a fever. I'm sorry, let me back up on this one. The state of Ohio does not require you to take an employee's temperature. It does require for most general offices for employees to self-certify that they do not have a fever. So you should be thinking about every day making sure that employees certify that they do not have any COVID-19 symptoms, including a fever of 100.4. If you decide that you don't want to simply have employees self-certify, that you do want to have employees take their temperature, that you do want to have visitors take their temperatures at work, there's a host of things to consider. Much like you did the walkthrough of your work environment, you'll want to do a bit of a walkthrough of how would you really be able to take an employee or visitor's temperatures. Where are you going to take them? Is there a private place at the entrance to your physical workspace that would allow some privacy while you're taking the employee's temperature? Who's going to be taking the employee's temperature? With what thermometer will you be taking temperatures? Are you making sure that the thermometers are sanitary and clean between each use? We really want to avoid a situation where you have multiple employees waiting within close proximity to each other while temperatures are being taken. And although I have not seen this issue litigated yet, if employees are spending a significant amount of time waiting to have their temperatures taken, and in this context under the FLSA, significant could mean simply more than 3 to 5 minutes waiting, you may be responsible for paying employees while they wait to have their temperatures taken. And most employers who have taken employee temperatures are doing it obviously before the workday starts for that employee. So you're taking the employee's temperature at the entrance to the facility. They probably haven't even had a chance to come in and write down that they are here or punch a time clock or do anything of that nature. So you'll need to think through that process of whether or not employees are being fairly compensated for any time spent waiting. Obviously, for visitors, clients, volunteers, the wage and hour issue doesn't apply. But if you will take employees or others' temperatures at work, there's a host of issues to consider as you prepare for that. And what do you do if you have an employee that has a fever or has other objective signs of either COVID-19 or an illness? As you can imagine, the answer is somewhat easy. Get them out of there or get them home. You absolutely can send employees home if they have a severe cough, if they simply aren't looking well, if they're pale, if they're sweating, if they have other issues. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have COVID-19, but it means that we're taking a very sensitive look at who is well and healthy enough to be in the workplace. And it's important to have a designated point of contact for employees who are feeling ill, whether they have been working remotely periodically or not. I've had a fair number of clients who have had remote working employees either quarantine or test positive for COVID-19, but because they were working from home, they never felt the need to notify the employer or the organization. And the problem with that assumption is that as an employer, if you don't know that a remote working employee has had COVID-19 and needs to be quarantined for a specific period of time, you may call them into the office. You may have them inadvertently come into your workplace when they shouldn't be. So have a designated point of contact for individuals, even if they're not entering your physical workspace. And importantly, before anybody, an employee, a visitor, a client, a volunteer is diagnosed with COVID-19, it's important to have a plan in place for that situation. The aspects of your contingency plan will include immediate notification to the health department that an employee or a visitor or a client has contracted COVID-19. Help the local health department facilitate contact tracing. And again, like social distancing, contact tracing was not in my vernacular two months ago. But in short, contact tracing means who was exposed to the individual that has now been diagnosed with COVID-19 in or around your workplace. Are there other employees that were within a close physical proximity to the person who was diagnosed? Were there other third parties who were in close physical proximity? Who were those employees? On what dates were they exposed? And then notifying those employees or third parties without identifying the ill employee, unless the person diagnosed with COVID-19 has given you explicit permission to do so. There is still an inherent privacy right if you have been diagnosed with COVID-19. It's my strong recommendation that we don't share that employee's name unless that individual has given us permission. And then if there's been a positive test of somebody who was in your workplace, it's recommended to shut down. You absolutely should sanitize to the greatest extent possible. And with respect to contact tracing, this is really brought up for many organizations who typically had a very fluid workplace. Lots of people coming in and out, lots of third parties or visitors, employees who worked outside of the workplace frequently, came back in. The contact tracing has, for many organizations, brought home the need to have documented who was physically in your workplace and when. So if you don't have a way of currently tracing or having a log or some verification of who was in the workplace when, you'll want to think about that. For some organizations, it's as simple as having a paper sheet of login and log out, although, as you can imagine, the less that we're touching of each other's things, the better. For other organizations, there are ways to place a notification on computers that says, pops up the day that they have come into the workplace and says, I am working physically from the workplace today. Think about creative and unique ways to know that an employee or a third party has been in your office so that when you are asked to contact trace, it's easier for you to retrace that individual's steps. So moving on to business and personal travel. For most organizations, non-essential business travel is still minimized to zero. Continue to encourage remote meetings. If your organization is ready for essential business travel to resume, just plan for employees who object to traveling, especially employees who may object to traveling via airplane. Determine in advance whether quarantine will be required upon arrival or return. So for example, there are some states that say if you're going to enter our state through air travel, you need to quarantine in your hotel for a 2-week period before you can leave. Those quarantine requirements are becoming less and less as states start to reopen, but do check for your specific location before the employee has to leave. It may not behoove you to have that business travel occur at all. And then in the state of Ohio, there no longer is an explicit requirement to quarantine upon return, but I just reiterate that these state rules are very fluid, and as we see reopening and if we see spikes, I would expect the states to continue to implement restrictions as necessary. So constantly keep on top of what the state orders require. Now for personal travel, employers have a lot of flexibility to determine how you're going to handle individuals who decide to take their Florida vacation on July 1st, who travel to New York City to travel other hotspots, things of that nature. So for personal travel, even where there is no state requirement to quarantine upon return, an organization can have quarantine requirements. So you as an organization could say, all employees who decide to travel for personal reasons via airplane are going to be required to work from home for 2 weeks after their vacation ends. And if you're not able to remote work, you simply have to take 2 weeks of unpaid time off. That's absolutely permissible. You could certainly do something short of that as well, delineating between employees who travel for who travel via airline or car, for employees who travel to certain hotspot locations or simply went up to Hocking Hills for the weekend. All of that can be determined solely in the discretion of the employer. You just have to make sure that your rules are being applied equally to all employees. And then finally, I do really want to talk about employee quote-unquote accommodations. This is where I see most issues, headaches, employer challenges occur. And I'm going to break it down into several sort of distinct categories. The first being employee fears because they or someone that they live with are in a high risk group for COVID-19 or who are immunocompromised. If the employee themselves is part of the high risk group or immunocompromised, you will need to think about whether you are subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act because you have 15 or more employees, or the state of Ohio's similar requirements that apply to individuals with organizations with 4 or more employees. Let's, for the sake of this presentation, assume that the ADA requirements apply to everybody. The ADA interactive process requires you to determine whether you can accommodate an employee either continuing to remote work or to take a leave of absence because their disability could lead to them having a higher risk of contracting COVID-19. Again, this is only for employees who themselves have underlying risks. It is absolutely acceptable to ask the employee to provide documentation from their treating physician to establish that they are high risk or immunocompromised. And it is absolutely appropriate to do this on a case-by-case basis to determine for that particular employee and their own job position what you can accommodate. So it may be that for one employee who is absolutely mission critical, you cannot accommodate them having a leave of absence or working remotely. For others who have less mission critical roles, you may be able to accommodate something. It's important to be consistent in our treatment, but this is a case-by-case analysis. The ADA just came out last week and reiterated that the ADA and this interactive process does not apply if it is the employee's relatives, family members, someone that they live with who is the individual with an underlying medical condition. So if an employee comes to you and says that their spouse is immunocompromised, they just finished cancer treatments or they have diabetes, and they're worried that returning to work will negatively impact their spouse's medical condition, the ADA process does not apply. You absolutely can make an exception and you can apply the ADA process, but it isn't required under the law. So you have to delineate between, is it the employee who has the medical condition that makes them high risk, or is it someone else? Beyond folks who actually have a medical condition, we've seen a lot of employees or frankly employees with spouses or other people in their household who are all in good health, but still concerned about returning to the physical workplace. For healthy employees, there is no obligation to accommodate this. Because allowing one employee to continue to remote working simply because they are afraid or have other underlying concerns that aren't medical related can balloon into allowing other employees not to come into the workplace. It's important to be consistent in our application. For employees with generalized fears, I recommend reminding them or informing them of all the sanitization and social distancing steps that you have undertaken. I'll reference back to that list that you created because I told you to do so at the beginning of the presentation. All of the steps that we took to ensure a healthy work environment can be discussed with them and encouraging them to return to work. You can provide leave of absence. That's absolutely permissible. But I just warn that you need to be consistent with how we apply those rules to everybody. A couple other issues that could hamper your return to work plan and that might require exception. The first being employees who only have access to public transportation. We're still learning a lot about COVID-19 and the virus itself. We get ongoing medical information about how long the virus lasts on surfaces, on metals, on other things like that. There is no doubt, in my mind at least, that folks who are on public transportation at least have a slightly greater risk of being exposed to the virus as opposed to people who transport themselves in their own car. So if an employee says to you that the only way that they can commute to work is via bus or Uber or some other form of public transportation here, and because of that they are concerned about returning to the workplace, you should consider that issue as well. Mainly because you want to ensure that as few germs, as few people potentially exposed to COVID-19 are in your workplace. So talk to that employee about alternatives, alternative access to transportation that would lessen the risk of being exposed to the general public. So it's certainly one thing to think about. The other issue that could hamper return are employees who have childcare issues due to the closure of, well, we're out of school now, but schools or daycares or summer camps. If you are an organization with less than 500 employees, you may have an obligation to provide emergency FMLA for up to 12 weeks for an employee whose daycare or summer camp has closed. Now, we've seen a reopening of daycares and some summer camps, although summer camps have closed simply because they weren't able to really reopen under or in time with the state's orders. If an employee has no other alternative care, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act and this 12 weeks of FMLA may be applicable to them. There is a small business exception under the FFCRA for employers with less than 50 employees. For this category, the small business exception, please make sure I'm clear that the exception does not apply to the 80 hours of paid sick leave that may be applicable to somebody who is ill with COVID-19, quarantined because of COVID-19, or caring for someone who's sick. The exception only applies to the 80 hours of paid sick leave for childcare issues due to the closure of schools or daycares, and to the emergency FMLA 10-week plus the 80-hour week period for the closure of schools and daycares. And that small business exception can be taken only where the circumstances would jeopardize the ongoing business concern. So if you as an organization would have to shut down because of that employee or other employees are taking the 12 weeks of leave, you may be able to be exempt from it. Excuse me. There's no filing requirement for the FFCRA exemption, but you do want to document why your organization is exempt. And then finally, and I'll try and get to some questions in the last 5 minutes we have here, other return issues. Once you are on site, or once you are ready to be on site, think about reestablishing the expectation of on-site work for those positions. You know, one of the things I've seen with general office environments is we've reopened, but there are a number of people who are continuing to work remotely, and that may be completely acceptable to you. But there may be times when there may come a point in time where you've decided that we need everybody back in. And so at that point, you would want to communicate the expectation of on-site work. If your organization has had a bit of a stall in the requirements for various positions because of the closure of the organization, or because we simply weren't seeing clients on site, think about whether you need to reestablish performance or attendance expectations with your employees. And then evaluate any other wage and hour issues that might have arisen. For example, a number of employers in the heat and throes of March and April were making various wage and hour either reductions or perhaps, not my favorite word, but hazard pay supplements. And those things were often tossed and sort of band-aid together because it was last minute, or furloughs were enacted very quickly. Go back and evaluate whether any of those wage and hour issues need cleaned up. And if so, now's the time to do it before any compliance issues balloon out of control. So that is my pre-prepared presentation, but Marcy, if there's any questions that I can answer in the minutes we have remaining, I'm happy to do so.
Yeah, thanks so much, Megan. We actually do have quite a few. I do want to just let everybody know really quick that we will be providing a copy of the slides as well as a recording of the presentation. One of the questions was how soon to expect the copies. Mike, I'm not sure, do you have a timeline for that?
So I can download the recording almost immediately after the call and send it over to you to share.
Okay.
We'll be able to put it out on United Way listservs.
Yeah, and I probably need to touch base with Veronica, but I would say probably within a week at the latest. I'm sure it would be sooner. But with that, we do have a couple of questions, Megan. And the first one, what if you have an employee who is immunocompromised and they are adamant that he or she wants to work in a position or take on duties that create a high risk of exposure to COVID-19?
Oh, great question. So the way I understand this question is, you know that an employee is immunocompromised. Perhaps you have employees who are also in the high-risk categories of being over 65 years old. The EEOC has said recently we absolutely cannot treat those employees differently because we know that they have an underlying condition. If the employee wants to work, they are permitted to work. It may seem counterintuitive to you to allow somebody who clearly, if exposed to the virus, could have extraordinary health issues or be negatively impacted by the virus. But it would actually be riskier to you as an organization to prevent that employee from working sort of in a altruistic or paternalistic manner due to the risk of that employee claiming an ADA sort of, you treated me inappropriately because of my disability context, than to allow them to continue working. So if somebody tells you that they want to work and they don't have any issues with working, my recommendation is, absent some objective symptoms of an employee. I'm not suggesting that if the employee is ill, we allow them in the workplace, but if they appear healthy and they just happen to have an immunocompromised system or underlying health conditions, if they are telling you that they want to work, then they should be able to do so.
I think we're coming up pretty close to 1 o'clock, but I think we can maybe squeeze in one more quick question. There was a comment that they understand many organizations are not notifying third parties that may have been exposed, but they are leaving it to the health department, as it puts the organization in the middle of the process and perhaps subject to litigation and giving medical advice. And so they have decided to take on the practice of tracking contact tracing to give to the health department. Do you have any comments on that?
So what I've seen for employers who have had a positive COVID test, the first thing we do is reach out to the health department. The health department will say to you, the organization, who was the individual in contact with in terms of employees and third parties. Now, depending on what health department you're located in, and frankly, even within the health department, I've seen different health department staff take different approaches. Most commonly, at least in Hamilton County, I've seen the health department ask for a list of employees at that site, particularly a list of employees who were in contact or close proximity to the individual who was exposed, as well as to third parties. And then the health department takes that information and contacts the individuals. From the vantage point of the organization, I have not seen a single employer not do the notification to their own employees. As you can imagine, it'd be very odd if the health department was contacting your colleagues saying, hey, we've had a positive COVID, and you as the employer weren't the first one to notify them. When it comes to third-party notifications, many employers are allowing the health department to contact those individuals directly. I would just say that that isn't the end-all be-all with respect to every health department, and there have been cases where the health department themselves have instructed the employers to notify the third parties themselves. I don't see a significantly high legal risk of an employer notifying a third party when you're not going to provide the name of that individual, as opposed to the health department notifying the individual. There's no HIPAA requirements or general privacy issues if you're simply notifying the individual, the third party individual, that when they were at your workplace, they may have come into contact with somebody who had COVID-19, and then directing that individual likely to the health department for further contact tracing and information.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Megan. We really appreciate you giving us your time today and sharing your wonderful knowledge on this topic. I think everybody found it extremely helpful. The other questions that we were not able to get to, I will share those with you.
Absolutely. And I'll be happy to get an answer to you guys this week with respect to anything I wasn't able to answer on the webinar.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for those of you who would like more information about Pro Bono Partnership of Ohio, of course, you can send us an email at info@pbpohio.org. And again, thank you to United Way of Greater Cincinnati for hosting.
Thanks, Marcy. Thanks, Mike. Hope everybody has a great day.